Welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast, presented by Orion Advisor Solutions and hosted by Dr. Daniel Crosby, Orion's Chief Behavioral Officer and New York Times bestselling author. Each week, Dr. Crosby interviews a fascinating new guest on a range of compelling topics, from literature to psychology to financial wellness. To learn more about Dr. Crosby's behavioral finance work at Orion, visit www.orion.com.
Hello and welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Daniel Crosby, and I'm joined today by Richard Shotton. Richard is one of the world's leading experts when it comes to applying behavioral science to marketing, and he is the author of two best-selling books, both of which received my highest recommendation. The name of the books are The Choice Factory and The Illusion of Choice. If you love behavioral science, if you like the sort of accessible work of a Dan Ariely or someone like that, I think you'll find both of his books really readable. We're here to talk about his most recent work today. Welcome to the show, joining us from London. Welcome.
Good to see you. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, always good to meet with a label mate, right? From the Harriman House crew.
Yeah, absolutely.
An impressive stable of authors they put together, if I do say so. So Richard, we're here to talk about your most recent book, The Illusion of Choice. I absolutely devoured both of your books, but given our limited time here today, we'll focus on The Illusion of Choice. And I want to talk about, you cover 16 and a half behavioral biases in there, which is a great hook. But it's that time of year. We're recording this in December, and it's that time of year when people start to think about changing their habits. And your first chapter has some great insights here. You cite research that 43% of our behavior is habitual, and then give some practical suggestions for improving those habits. If so much of what accounts for our behavior is habitual, what hope do we have, and how can we change that as we look to the new year?
Oh, it's a great question, and a very topical one. So you mentioned that 43% stat. That comes from some work from Wendy Wood. So really simple study, gives people a buzzer, and over a period of a couple of weeks, whenever the buzzer goes off, people have to write down what they're doing, what they're thinking about, where they are, a few different questions. And she essentially defines behavior as habitual if people are doing the same thing at the same time and place while they're thinking something else. Now, she does this in a few different ways. So the study I talk about was 43%. Other studies might come out at 40, they might come out at 50. The exact number isn't really important, but what you say is that a huge proportion of our behaviour is habitual. That's the big thing. So if you are either interested in changing your own behaviour or the behaviour of other people, you've got to take into account habits. Now, when it comes to things like our own behaviour and changing our habits around New Year's, there are a couple of studies that people could very, very easily apply. There is a study by Steve Martin, not the actor, the Columbia psychologist, and he showed when working in Britain with doctors, and remember we have a free healthcare service. Also, it's free at point of usage. So a unique thing that we probably have in the UK that you don't have so much in America is because people aren't paying directly for a service, they often do not turn up to the doctor's appointment. But what Martin found was that if at a previous appointment, rather than just the receptionist giving the patient their time and date to turn up, if you either got the patient to say out loud and repeat back the time and date of the next appointment, or you got the patient to write down when and where they were going to come back, there was a significant improvement in return rates. So it reduced no-shows by 3.5% when it was verbalized, 18% when it was written down. Martin's argument is one of the big drivers of human behavior is a desire to be consistent with our past selves. But that is only activated if there is a degree of involvement, if it's an active rather than passive commitment. So if you want to go out and run a marathon, or you want to stop drinking or eat less crisps or chips, don't just internally tell yourself you can do that. Write it down, tell lots of other people, and then you are working with human nature rather against it. There will be an extra pressure which is going to make it more likely that you follow through. So that first principle would be the power of an active commitment. That'd be the first thing.
So I was at a baseball game a few years ago.
Yeah.
and there was a tent there and some young college students that were asking people to sign a commitment not to drink and drive after the game. And it was really based on this kind of work and like the work of Cialdini around consistency and commitment and these sorts of things. And it was undergrad psychology students who were doing this.
Yeah.
This thing has no teeth, right? It's not like you're in extra trouble, right? It's just like, hey, I, Daniel Crosby, promise not to drink and drive after the game. And I'm like, oh, this is so fascinating, but it really is powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. Because most people don't want to feel like hypocrites. And it is easier to concoct a story if you have only ever internally thought something. You can kind of get out of with some loopholes. If you've actually written something down, it's much harder to explain to yourself why you are not being a hypocrite if you then go and drink and drive.
Yeah.
Interestingly, the Pacific island of Palau did something called the Palau Pledge. When you arrived at customs, they would stamp your passport with this giant passport stamp, and there was a space, and in the stamp essentially committed to not littering or destroying stuff, and you had to sign it to come to the country, and that was shown to have a significant effect on people's behaviour. There's no real way of anyone ever enforcing that. It was self-policed, as you say. So use these biases, recognise the operating system that we have, and use them to your benefit. The other one that people might find useful would be, it is very easy to think the way to change behaviour is just to boost your motivation. Read loads about why running's brilliant or going to the gym's brilliant. But there isn't a great link between increasing motivation, increasing appeal, and changing behaviour. And people like Sarah Mill at the University of Bath argue that motivation and appeal is a necessary but not sufficient condition for behaviour change. What you need to do is combine that motivation with a cue or a trigger. So a particular time, place, or a mood that you associate with a behaviour. So the argument here, which BJ Fogg often makes, would be, don't say to yourself, I'm going to do 10 press-ups a day. Say, I'm going to do 10 press-ups after I brush my teeth. I'm going to do 10 press-ups when I walk in through the door when I get back from work. You've got to associate the behaviour with a particular moment. And if you do that, you're also much more likely to follow through on your resolutions.
So tie that new desired behavior to an existing behavior, brushing your teeth, whatever, lay out the gym clothes in the morning. So I've never been more consistent about going to the gym than I have been in the last few months. And it's because I take my daughter to an early morning Bible study every morning at 6:30. And so it's like, well, I'm cold. I'm cold. I'm already cold. I'm already dressed. I'm out of the house. Like, what's the excuse? So it makes it very easy to tie that goal of going to the gym with this thing I already have to do.
I think that's a really nice example, because again, it runs often counter to people's beliefs. People think that what they do is a factor of their desire and motivation, and of course that's important. Behavioural science isn't trying to say everything's counterintuitive, but the argument is what we tend to underestimate is the effect of small barriers or small bits of friction. There's an amazing study from Rosen at the University of Pennsylvania where he looks at whether people have healthy foods or not, and he runs this study with a cafeteria. And sometimes the healthy vegetables are in bowls that are close to where people walk past, and there are spoons to serve themselves. Other times he pushes the bowls 12 inches away and replaces the large serving spoons with tongs. That is a trivial bit of friction, but even that reduces vegetable consumption of the order, I think it's about 8 to 16% depending on the vegetable. So the argument for behavioural scientists is if you want to do something, make it easier. It'll have a disproportionately large effect. If you don't want to do something, just make it slightly harder. Now that you can apply very easily when it comes to diet. Don't have the chips in the house. You have to walk 5 minutes to the nearest shop to get them. That will put people off. Don't buy giant 250 gram bags. Buy 10 bags of 25. Anything that puts a little hurdle even a seemingly trivial hurdle in the way of the bad behavior will have a bigger than expected effect.
We've even gone to buying shelled pistachios with the shells on versus the pre-shelled ones, because there's research around that. Like, and look, pistachios are not the worst thing in the world for you, but it's easy to pound 2 handfuls of pistachios if you don't have to do the work. Just that little bit of friction makes it more effortful and makes you more thoughtful. So I have you are an encyclopedia of the research around these things. So I'm hoping I'm going to go off script a bit.
Okay. What could possibly go wrong? Yeah.
And I'll hope that you've heard of this. To your first point about the New Year's resolution, sort of making this public commitment, writing it down, getting it out there, that makes a great deal of intuitive sense to me. And it's, consistent with all the commitment and consistency research. But I've also heard a contrary stream of research that says that effectively, when you make a public commitment, right? If I get on Facebook on January 1st and say, new year, new me, this is the year I lose 20 pounds, and everyone goes, good for you, you can do it, you're the best, then I've kind of gotten what I needed out of that interaction, right? Like, what I wanted was to feel supported and good, and now I feel encouraged and good, and now there's actually less motivation to make that goal. Have you ever heard any sort of negative impacts of publicly stating your goals like that?
So I haven't seen that research. I wonder if some of that might come back to what type of statement you make. Yeah, if you say, I'm going to run a marathon on April the 2nd, that is a very clear goal, which there's no wiggle room. If you say, I'm going to lose some weight, maybe there's enough wiggle room that buzz of people saying well done and the vagueness of the aspiration, that might be the kind of the toxic mix. But that's me speculating.
Yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense to me. Like, is it a vague sort of commitment to being better, or is it, by June 1st, I will have lost 20 pounds, hold me to it, check in with me,
Yeah.
I work out with these 2 guys in the morning, and I committed to, one of them is in incredible shape. And one of them, he'll do like 200 flights of stairs on the Stairmaster.
Good God. Yeah.
He's asked me to do that with him, and I told him I would by the end of the year. And we're getting awfully close, and, he's going to hold me to it, and I may die. This may be our last podcast, but thank you. That makes a lot of sense. Your speculation there.
On that, maybe a more, there is a study that I think is related. There is an idea called moral licensing. So the study, I think I'm not 100% sure how to pronounce his name. It's CHIOU. So I think this is Chew, but apologies if it's I've bungled the pronunciation. He does a very clever study. I think it's about 10 years old now. Recruits a group of smokers, and he gives them all sugar pills. Half of them are told these are placebo sugar pills. Half of them are told they are vitamin pills. So he lies to half of them. He then invites them, he's given them a diary to record what they do over the 2 weeks. He then invites them 2 weeks later into his lab, where they have to fill in this huge form saying how much alcohol they've drunk, how much they've smoked, how much they've exercised, all these kind of virtuous behaviors. And he finds that the people who think they were on the vitamins were more likely to have done negative behaviors like binge drinking, less likely to have done positive behaviors like eating vegetables. So his argument is this is something called moral licensing. If we think we've done something for our health, like take the vitamin, we can overcompensate in other areas. Now, of course, that's all claims data, and behavioural scientists are often suspicious of what people say they've done. So the clever bit in the experiment, and why it sticks in my mind, why I really like it, is I mentioned in the beginning, everyone here is a smoker. Chew has given people really irritating long surveys to fill in, because what he's actually doing is monitoring how long it takes before people light up their cigarettes. And he finds that those who had the vitamins or think they had the vitamins, or everyone has sugar pills, they are much, much more likely to light up, and they light up quicker than the people who were told they were having a placebo sugar pill. So that's, I think, maybe something to watch out for in a related area. And it's one reason why, if you're a manufacturer or a brand and you are, let's say, improving your product by making it more environmentally friendly, or you're taking out some of the nasty artificial colors, if you're really concerned about people's health and the environment, you might not want to tell them because they might overcompensate elsewhere.
Offsetting penalties, as it were. Yeah, fascinating. So let's move to the pandemic, right? The pandemic to me feels a bit like a hazy, surreal memory. But you mentioned a public service announcement from the pandemic of roughly 100 years ago.
Yeah.
That still sticks with folks. And it was this rhyme that coughs and sneezes spread diseases. And it's an example of this psychological effect known as the rhyme as reason effect, which is sort of a sub-facet of the fluency effect. So most of my listeners are financial professionals, financial advisors. For a financial advisor who is tasked with, educating her clientele and helping them understand sort of the fundamentals of investing in personal finance, how could understanding these ideas of fluency effects impact the way that she goes?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think there's a couple of related studies, because you're absolutely right. The rhyme as reason effect, sometimes known as the Keats heuristic, study going back to the 1999-2000, Matthew McGlone and Tawfiq Bash were the academics. They showed people were more likely to believe rhyming phrases than non-rhyming equivalents. And they said exactly what you did, which is, if it's easy to process, we conflate that with believability. I replicated their study, but rather than ask about believability, did memory. And you're absolutely right. Things like coughs and sneezes spread diseases sticks in the mind much, much more than coughs and sneezes spread illness. Rhymes stick in our heads. Yeah. So, of course, you could apply that completely literally and go out and say, well, I'm going to make my recommendations rhyme. Now, you might be able to do that on occasion, but you might feel it's not serious enough, or it just doesn't quite work in the individual setting you have. Other experiments I think could be super relevant and really easy applied by finance professionals. So there's one study by Oppenheimer, and it's probably the best ever academic title for a paper. So it's Erudite Vernacular, Utilized Irrespective of Necessity. Then there's a colon, and it said Problems with Using Long Words Needlessly. And what Oppenheimer does is, and this is Daniel Oppenheimer, not the Oppenheimer of the film fame, so it's a much more recent study. He gets complex bits of text, shows them to some people in their original format. Other people, he shows the same text, but he takes out the unnecessary jargon and replaces that jargon with simpler alternatives. Both groups are asked to rate the intelligence of the author, and Oppenheimer finds that it's the group who have the simpler version. They think the author is 13% more intelligent than the group who saw the complex version. That, I think, would be super useful to anyone who's working in finance, because I think most people who work in serious industries like finance or medicine labour under the misassumption that to come across as professional, as intelligent, as brilliant, you should drown in jargon. You should wrap up your prose in unnecessarily convoluted words. Oppenheimer says that is completely wrong. If you want to impress people, speak as simply and plainly as possible. And in the world of finance, and very topically, Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett would be, the paragons of that. You can I've put, in fact, some of the Berkshire Hathaway annual reports into a system called Hemingway, and it rates the reading age. And off memory, I think it's probably 15 or 16 is the reading age. You put in a big consultancy or accounting firm's annual report, and it will be off the charts. It'll be postgraduate reading level. And Berkshire Hathaway are talking about very complex topics, but they speak about them in the simplest possible language. That, I think, would be something very simple for finance professionals to apply.
Well, using the rhyme as reason effect, that is news you can use, because I think I see this a lot with young advisors. They drown in jargon, like you said. They have this feeling of inadequacy or nervousness about being perceived as serious or knowledgeable, and so they sort of overcompensate with big words and excessive complexity. I do love the title of that study.
Yeah,
fascinating. It's fascinating to know that people actually perceive you as less intelligent when you feel the need to use these long, convoluted words.
Absolutely. And then the other one that's a kind of subset of that is if you simplify your language, what you often do is move from abstract to concrete. And then if you do that, and it's not repeating the same point, it's a slightly different point. There's some lovely work by Ian Begg, who's a Canadian psychologist, goes back to the 1970s, and he describes concrete words as ones that you can visualize. So he used a test where he gave people long lists of words, some of which were visualizable, like square door, some which were intangibles, what he called abstract phrases like a subtle fact. And what Begg found was that people were 4 times more likely to remember the visualizable concrete phrases over the abstract. Now, if you are giving someone advice and you spend an hour with them, realistically, a day later, 2 days later, there's going to be a handful of things that are remembered at best. And the things that will be remembered are the ideas that you managed to convey in a way that was visible in their mind's eye, as it were. What you need to do, I think, if you are conveying detailed abstract concepts, is think, how do I translate that into something that my audience can visualize? Because Begg's argument was vision is the most powerful of our senses. So if you use a word like square door, the audience can picture that, they can imagine it, it's very, very sticky. If you say something like basic truth, it's an abstraction, it's very, very forgettable. And if you look at the masters of communication, people like Steve Jobs, they do this again and again and again. So if you look at an old iPod ad, they don't say 128 megabytes of memory. They say 1,000 songs in your pocket. You can picture a pocket, you can imagine a song. And that would be another tactic that people should think about using if they want to be memorable.
That is so useful because we have, in finance and fitness and nutrition and a million places, we have this implementation gap where I heard research this week that 70% of clients implement less than 20% of the financial advice that they're given. And I think excessive complexity has a lot to do with that. So if we aim for simplicity in concreteness, right? Concreteness being what application and ability to visualize, simplicity and concreteness, to the people listening to this, examine your persuasive appeals, your advice, your marketing materials, or simplicity and concreteness seems like a really, really great place to start.
Yeah, I think those would be 2 tactics that anyone could apply tomorrow, and especially with the concreteness one, it can have a very, very large effect.
Yeah. In chapter 9, you talk about the power of experimentation, and I love this. You give the example of Christian Aid asking for donations, I think at the holidays, and you listed a number of different appeals that had seemingly a lot in common, but the results were very different. And we see this in finance too. There's this famous study about, if you ask people, could you save 20% of your money? Almost everyone says no. Like, that's too high. Like, a 20% savings rate is way too high. But if you say, well, hey, could you live on 80% of your income? Everyone says yes. And I think that this surprises people who aren't schooled in behavioral science, that just a subtle tweak in the framing or the wording of an appeal can have such an incredible impact. Talk to us about the research around that.
Yeah, this was, and I don't know if Christian Aid do this in every country. I know there are often, the US and the UK are very similar, but not in all aspects. So what they do in the UK is they have a week during the year where they put envelopes through people's doors, and then they say, they'll come back in 4 or 5 days' time, collect it with whatever money you've put in. and the ad agency Ogilvy are in charge of their advertising. And they're very good, Ogilvy, because they will publish the findings from their behavioural science studies, whether they work or not. And I think that's an awfully good reflection on them. They publish things that don't work as well. And what they showed was, back, I think it was in 2018, they ran that Christian Aid test. Huge scale, 7 million letters go out. That's, population of the UK is 68 million. It's about a tenth of the population get one of these. And they test lots of different messages to try and maximise income. The worst performer was telling people about the tax benefits. If you give us £1, we'll get 25 pence back from the government. That got about 18 pence on average, I think, per letter put through the door. The best performer, it might have been the second best performer, which is a surprising one, which is when they improved the paper stock of the envelope. So it became a bit thicker, a bit glossier, a bit fancier. That led to a more than a doubling of donation rates versus that worst performer. So it's 38, 39 pence per letter they got from that one. Now, at first you think, well, why would that happen? But people make decisions in snap, quick, reflexive ways. And I think what happens, if you see a shonky bit of paper come through, you probably feel like 50 pence is a perfectly fine donation. If it comes through and it's glossy and shiny and looks really nice, you probably think you might look like a miser if you only put in 50 pence, so you put in a pound, say. So it's this counterintuitive finding that by increasing the cost of the paper stock, you increase people's mental benchmark for what's a reasonable amount to give to define themselves as generous. Now, I think seeing those results, it's very easy to come up with a plausible post-rationalization. If I'm being completely honest, if you'd asked me beforehand, I'm not sure if I would have ordered it in that way. And so therefore, we should always have a humility. People are complex. Context is important. Don't assume that what's worked in one situation will always work in another. Don't assume that we always have full insight into people's motivations. And therefore, the single best thing you can do is run tests. So if you ever hear about a bias or an insight you think could be useful for your practice, firstly, don't question people. Don't say to them, would you be more likely to pick me if you knew I was popular? People will deny that, although it always tends to work. Instead, maybe with your emails, with your social media marketing, randomize people into two groups, A versus B. Sometimes you use costly signaling, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you use implementation intention, sometimes you don't. It's that test and control approach that is a much better way of getting to people's genuine motivations.
Yeah. One of the things that I think is great about, for the listeners, if you read Richard's 2 books, I think you're going to come away with practical experiments that you can run in your business. You'll say, okay, what would happen if we tried to frame it like this, or if we changed our customer experience a little bit like that? And then you test it and you A/B test it and you see in sort of a low stakes way. And it's a potentially a very powerful thing.
Yeah. And one of the great things about behavioral science is many of the insights can be harnessed almost costlessly. It's changing a word here, a word there. It's changing, the language that you use, or how you present some statistics. You've got to use some language. You've got to present statistics in one way or another. It's just making sure you are using the optimal approach. So once you've read about these biases, there's not a cost to implement them. It's not that you then have to run a $10 million TV ad to take advantage of them.
Right.
Very small changes can have a large effect.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk about one chapter that draws on the power of humor. And you cite research that compared diners who received a joke with their bill or their check versus those who just received a bill. So those whose waiter made a joke were more than twice as likely to tip, and they left a tip that was 7% larger on average. I feel like I need to get this out to the service industry.
Yeah.
Leaving a lot of money on the table. In a field like finance, again, most of my listeners are coming from that world. In a field like finance, where we know that humor is powerful. We know that it does a lot to bombard us to make us likable. We know that it makes education more memorable. One of the reasons I try and weave some humor into my presentations is because of the research shows it makes it more memorable. in a field like finance, what's the appropriate application of this behavioral reality that humor is sticky when it could also make you appear unserious about what is a very serious?
So I really like the approach here of what you're essentially suggesting is you have these findings, and the finding is the finding, but everyone is in their own unique situation, and you've got to think, well, is the experiment here about relevant for my particular field? Now, I think this general theme about mood and humor and positivity and likability, there are definitely some things that can be applied in finance. So one watch out would be, if you want to change the behavior of your clients, be very, very careful about fear tactics. So that, which is almost the polar opposite of humor. There's a amazing study, 2009 by George Lowenstein. I think Dwayne Seppi might have been his colleague at the time, both at Carnegie Mellon. And they are given access to Vanguard's data. So it's anonymized data telling them how often people check into their portfolios. And what they basically see is when the stock market is rising, lots of people check in. They look at how much wealth they have, how it's getting bigger. When the stock market falls, people radically reduce how much they look at their portfolio. Now, Lowenstein's argument is, this is slightly illogical. The information about your wealth and status is just as relevant in both situations. But, he argues, what people are doing is they are responding to a situation that causes them unhappiness by metaphorically sticking their heads in the sand. So he calls it the ostrich effect. He says, look, when we get bad news, like we're not going to have enough money for our retirement, we could deal with that by addressing the underlying issue. We're not saving enough. Or we could simply solve the problem by ignoring it, not even thinking about it, brushing under the carpet. And the argument from other studies suggests that if change is hard, scaring people tends to backfire. If change is really easy, fear can be useful. But if it's hard to change, the most likely response to scaring someone is for them to just stop thinking about the problem in its entirety. So I would certainly think between positivity versus fear, I would be erring on the side of positivity. I think that's the first one. Avoid the flip side, which is being overly pessimistic and trying to scare people. Now, going on to humor, there are quite a lot of experiments that suggest it's more memorable. We're more like to notice communications that are humorous. People could think, well, okay, this might undermine my credibility. And I think if you're going to think that, it's fair enough, but I don't think you should reject the findings completely out of hand. What you might want to focus more is on something like likability, which is almost like a softer version. There's a wonderful set of studies into an idea called the halo effect. So I think the original studies were 1930s by people like Thorndike, but the more rigorous studies came along in the 70s and 80s by people like Nisbet. And one of the Nisbet studies, he gets a lecturer, I think he's Belgian, to give a video presentation. And it's exactly the same content, but on one occasion he presents it in a friendly, affable manner. On other occasions, grumpy and unfriendly. Now, one group sees the friendly presenter, one group sees the unfriendly presenter. Of course, as you'd expect, when it comes to rating the professor, his likability varies between the two viewings. That's exactly what you expect. What's slightly more surprising is completely unrelated characteristics change too. So his accent, remember he was Belgian, that's seen as irritating when he's behaved unfriendly. His looks, he's seen as much worse looking when he's being unfriendly. All sorts of unrelated characteristics change according to his friendliness. Nisbet says this is an example of the halo effect. He argues that people are always looking for shortcuts. And what we tend to do is if someone has one dominant characteristic, we don't then weigh all their other characteristics up independently. We are influenced by that dominant characteristic. So if someone is amazingly good looking or they're very, very friendly, we're going to think they're more intelligent, they're more charitable, they're more honest. that I think fits in many situations in finance. It is very, very hard to work out if an advisor is authoritative or trustworthy. What it's easy to work out is whether you like that person. And what often happens is when people are faced with complex calculations that are hard to work out, they often replace them with simpler questions that are much, much easier. So rather than think, is this advisor intelligent, knows what they're talking about, we replace it with, do I like it? Is it fun to spend time with him or her? So yes, you might think it's pushing it too far to go down the amusement route, but I think the halfway house might be something. Think about, well, in that case, why don't I think about likability as a more palatable metric? None of those downsides of looking like a clown, but at the same time, a big, big upside of the halo effect.
That's absolutely fascinating research. There's research out in the last year about what people are looking for in an advisor, and I talk about it ad nauseum on this program. But it's someone who understands me, someone with whom I share values, and someone I could see myself hanging out with socially. And like you said, it's this answering an easier question, right? Like, is it hard? There's 300,000 financial advisors in the U.S. Is it hard to parse the qualifications of the one in front of me relative to the other 299,000? Like, yeah, that's very hard. But can I know if they're approachable and affable and easy to talk to? Like, yeah, I can know that almost immediately. So really focus your efforts and even your client service process on likability. Very easy to do and seems like a very easy, inexpensive way to stand out.
Yeah, absolutely. And if people are operating in situations of uncertainty, the people who listen, may well have dedicated their lives to finance, but their clients, it's a small sliver of their day-to-day life. So in situations of uncertainty, people are often looking for simple rules of thumb that can act as proxies instead of a deep considered analysis of the situation. So it might be, is this person affable? Are they similar to me? Or it might be social proof. Have lots of other people like me chosen this advisor? Those rules of thumb that people use are interesting insights that I think most advisors could harness better.
Yeah. Well, Richard, anyone who's listened to this, that Richard by now is an absolute encyclopedia of all things behavioral. I think that is enough proof that you need to go check out his 2 books. Tell us the name of the 2 books again. Tell us where folks can learn more about you. You have online courses. Where can folks get more of this good stuff you've shared with us today?
So I've got 2 books. The Choice Factory was the first one, and then the second was The Illusion of Choice. And there's a different selection of experiments in both those books. If any of your listeners are Spanish, The Choice Factory has come out in Spanish as well. I think the translation might have changed the title. I think something like how to get people to buy more in Spanish. And then, I tweet a lot about interesting research I find at the handle @Shotton. And I've created a self-paced course, especially for people who work in marketing. It's mainly focused at kind of business owners or people who work in marketing. A website called ferment.io. And that's 7 or 8 hours of content that people can do at their own pace, all around taking these academic studies and then looking at the practical ways that people can apply them. Well,
incredible work. I've just finished Rory Sutherland's series of behavioral finance courses. I'm actually a little upset with Rory. We both spoke at an event recently, and he edged me out for the highest ranking.
Oh, I mean, to be fair, I mean, he's a brilliant speaker. Lots of good jokes. And if people haven't read his book, Alchemy, I think that would be a strong recommendation. Although I think in the US, sometimes publishers change the titles by market, but it's his latest book. Oh, is it Alchemy? Okay.
Alchemy here, yeah. It was whatever year it came out, a couple years ago. It was the best book I read that year for sure. So
yeah, great. It's a great book.
If you got to get edged out by someone,
he's
the one. But I will be taking your course next. And
fantastic!
Richard, just absolutely fantastic stuff. The books are incredible. Check them out. Richard, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
Thanks for tuning in to Standard Deviations. If you can't wait till next week for more behavioral finance insights, visit www.orion.com. All opinions expressed by Dr. Daniel Crosby and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of or endorsement by Orion and its affiliates, subsidiaries, and employees. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for legal, tax, and investment decisions. The opinions are based upon information the participants consider reliable.